Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the penultimate class and the final week of Unfinished Tales. This has been a really long, fun journey, and I don't want it to end, but we're almost there. Before we start, a couple of announcements I want to make first and most urgently. Don't forget that tomorrow, the last session of the class, is one of the special bonus sessions in the Europe-friendly time. Though, as Yana reminded me today on Facebook, thanks to Daylight Savings Time, class is starting right now in Europe at 1:30 in the morning instead of 2:30 in the morning. I mean, Yana, what are you going to do after class? That's what I want to know. But anyhow, with all that extra time you've now gained. But anyway, yeah, we'll be going at 4 o'clock p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. So it'll be even earlier, only 8 p.m. Yana. So how about that? Anyway, so as I say, 4 p.m. Eastern Time tomorrow will be our final class. So we will talk about the. I'm not even going to deceive myself into thinking we're going to get to the Palantiri tonight, since I didn't get to the Istari at all last time. So we're going to do the Wizards tonight, and tomorrow's class we're going to do the Palantiri, but we're also going to do Q&A. So any questions that you guys have, anything you've been saving up, make sure that you email them to me, or you can the easiest thing for you to do is to email them to me, but you can post them on my social media. You can wait and ask me the question during the session if you'd like to, any of those things. I am sending you now the link to tomorrow's session, in case you don't have that. That's the session for tomorrow at 4 p.m. So that will be our final wrap up of Unfinished Tales. So that's the first and most immediate announcement. Now, the second announcement, not exactly an announcement so much as a confirmation. You guys will have all heard, I don't doubt by now, that our next book officially is Ender's Game at last. Having come so close 2 times, Ender's Game has finally won the election. So we're going to be doing Ender's Game. And just to clarify, a couple of people have been asking me this, because I know, of course, there are a number of books in sort of the Ender's Game series. We're talking about the first book, just Ender's Game. It is, of course, a good deal shorter than the books we've been reading. It's a good deal shorter than Unfinished Tales or The Return of the King, so we're going to spend less time on it. I mean, it will be a much shorter class. These classes, the fact that we've had 2 books which have required, 10 to 13 classes each at the end of the day, is not necessarily an indication of how I plan for all of these classes to go. It's just a reflection of which books happen to have been elected. As you can see, I was none too conservative in budgeting for my course time allotments here for Unfinished Tales. We're barely going to squeak through. So we're gonna do probably 5, I think, episodes in the end for Ender's Game, which means we'll be having another election fairly soon into the class. The class is going to be starting during the first week of April. So if I'm remembering correctly, that means April 1st is the date of the first class. So it will not be a joke. It will not be a deception. It will be a genuine thing, our first class on Ender's Game. And then we'll be studying it basically for the month of April. And we'll be done near the beginning of May. So that is the medium-range plan for the Mythgard Academy classes. The third thing that I wanted to just tell you about is we have not yet announced the summer courses for the Mythgard Institute, our regular courses. But they're going to be coming out very soon. I hope to be able to make those announcements, to be able to post those publicly in the next couple of days. But I can give you a kind of sneak peek into what our classes are going to be. Oh, Annie, no, there's not a webpage yet for Ender's Game. That there will be soon, though. I hope that we'll have that by the end of the week, and I'll certainly be posting that so you can see sort of the breakdown of things. Good question. Anyway, so the 3 classes, the three classes will be running through the Mythgard Institute. I'm going to be continuing my Chaucer class. I'm going to teach a class on Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And really, Chaucer is just more fun than any author I know. I'm so looking forward to doing my Canterbury Tales class. I've been doing Chaucer's early works this semester, and that's been really great, and I'm really looking forward to doing the Canterbury Tales next semester. So I'm going to be teaching my Canterbury Tales class. Dr. Amy Sturgis is doing her Harry Potter class. Dr. Sturgis is the very first person ever to have taught a university course on Harry Potter, like in the world. Her Harry Potter class was the first one ever. And also the first Harry Potter class taught at Mythgard, and she is teaching it again. She hasn't taught it in 3 years, but she's teaching that. Anyway, we're going to be I'm very excited to see that course again. And then our third class is going to be a class by a new Mythgard instructor, another wonderful Tolkien scholar who is joining us. And this is Robin Ann Reed, who's been she's been so involved in so many things in Tolkien scholarship. She's not only a wonderful scholar herself, but a wonderful facilitator of scholarship. She has a really great online Tolkien scholarship project going, and she has been coordinating the Tolkien conference at Kalamazoo over the last few years. She's been really great. And she's teaching a class on The Lord of the Rings, which focuses on the 20th century phenomenon, both leading up to it and after it, both the reader's response to it and sort of a cultural studies approach to The Lord of the Rings, looking at both the immediate impacts on The Lord of the Rings and the immediate impact of The Lord of the Rings, not only on English and American society, but on other societies, looking at its translation history and the role that it has played internationally, culturally. It should be a really cool, fascinating class. Yes, Chaz, Robin Reed of Texas A&M at Commerce fame, exactly. Robin is great. You know, one of the things Tolkien studies. Starting with Tom Shippey and others, Tolkien studies has been dominated by medievalists pretty much since its inception. And that's not shocking, of course, given all of the medieval stuff that Tolkien loved. And there's so many things that that medievalists get excited about when they see it in Tolkien that, 20th century scholars, that is to say, scholars of 20th century literature, don't get nearly as excited about. And so it has always made sense to me that medievalists would be more excited about Tolkien than people who study other 20th century authors. Robin Reed is one of the best Tolkien scholars that I know, who really deals with Tolkien as a 20th century phenomenon. That is her field. She's not approaching it from a medieval point of view, and that should be really cool. So that's a very different kind of class. It'll be, studying The Lord of the Rings, which I assume that most of you are tolerably familiar with, but it will be a really interesting and different look at it. Verlin Flieger's not teaching a class this semester. She's not teaching a course with us this summer, but she'll be back again in the fall. She's designing a brand new Tolkien class in the fall, where she's going to be looking at a bunch of looking at especially sort of the frames of Tolkien stories, looking at the stories in which Tolkien makes use of a frame mechanism, things like the Notion Club papers and stuff like that. It's going to be really cool. And actually, this is a brand new class that she's never taught before that she's designing for the fall semester. So, anyway. Let's see. Brian is asking, do I mean a more of an along the beam kind of an approach? No, not exactly. This is more of a looking at it's not just looking at the beam. In some ways, one way to characterize what I believe Professor Reed is going to be doing in that class is, in essence, a third thing. That is, I've been talking about looking at the beam and looking along the beam, of course, borrowing C.S. Lewis's language from his essay that I talked about at the beginning of this class. What Professor Reed is going to be doing is in a sense looking sort of parallel to the beam. That is, looking at what the beam does when it strikes the floor, looking at the impact, what it illuminates around it, and the kind of impact that it has on the things that it strikes. A lot of people talk about Tolkien being the father of the fantasy genre. Well, what does that mean? How did that happen? What kind of impact did Tolkien actually have? People say often flippantly, I've said flippantly many times before, things like, Tolkien was just, had a huge impact on millions of readers readers. Well, what impact? How? And she's going to go further to say, what kind of impact did it have on people in totally different cultures? How are other cultures who are translating it into other languages? How are they interacting with the texts, and how are they interacting differently? So anyway, that's what I am really excited about by this class is that people are going to get a chance to study really carefully and think about carefully, the kind of thing that a lot of people just sort of wave their hands at generally. So I think that it's really it should be a lot of fun. Okay, let's see. Good. All right. Well, let's start. I don't want to lose too much time because we do. I actually want to talk about like wizards and stuff tonight. So, but that's the end of my announcements. So let's go on and talk about the Istari. So, I want to begin with the blue wizards, because that's where people always start. That is the questions that whenever I get questions about the wizards, people always want to talk about the blue wizards first. So I thought I would just begin with kind of condensing everything that we know about the blue wizards. And the other reason that I wanted to do this is that I think by looking at the stuff on the blue wizards, which is relatively brief, all of it, we can see a kind of pattern, I think, that I think will be interesting in kind of trying to put together all of the different materials that we get here. Because, of course, in this chapter on the Istari, we get, as we've gotten in other places, most notably in the Galadriel and Celeborn chapter, a collection of different texts that come in at different times. That is to say, we're not just getting, an extra story or something that Tolkien has written or something that he began and didn't finish, but we're given a little glimpse of how his thought went on to change, how his ideas developed over the decades that followed the publication of The Lord of the Rings. So, of course, we spent a lot of time tracing that with Galadriel and Celeborn. We looked at that a little bit last time, thinking about Khan Buri-Khan and the way in which the stories of the Druidan kind of grew out from around the seeds that were sown there in The Return of the King. Here, again, we'll see a couple different discrete stages. And to me, the Blue Wizards represent the most dramatic sort of sense of the development there. The trajectory of the Blue Wizards is, I think, more dramatic than any of the other wizards' trajectories in this. So I think that that's makes them a good place to start. So let's start there. All right. So we begin. Where we're beginning here is in the essay on the Istari. So the first text that Christopher Tolkien leads with is what he calls the essay on the Istari. It was written in 1954, which date you may remember as being right in the middle of the publication process of The Lord of the Rings. And the reason for this, if you recall from way back in the introduction of Unfinished Tales, Christopher Tolkien explained that the essay on the Istari was originally an index entry. It was like a glossary piece, and it raged completely out of control. It was really just meant to be an explanation of the word Istari and became this big, long thing. I just love that. That's one of that just seems to me so like Tolkien in a nutshell in some ways. But anyhow, in this essay, so here's what he has to say about the Blue Wizards in this essay. Of the blue, little was known in the West, and they had no names save Ithrin Luin, the Blue Wizards, for they passed into the East with Curanir, but they never returned, and whether they remained in the East, pursuing there the purposes for which they were sent, or perished, or as some hold, were ensnared by Sauron and became his servants, is not now known. But none of these chances were impossible to be. For, strange indeed though this may seem, the Istari, being clad in bodies of Middle-earth, might even as men and elves fall away from their purposes, and do evil, forgetting the good in the search for power to effect it. So, as far as the Blue Wizards themselves are concerned, what we learn about them here is almost nothing. That is to say, we don't know what their names are, right? Their names are not known. The purposes for which they went east are unknown, and what happened to them out there, their destiny, is unknown. So as far as hard information we get about them, there's really two things only that we know for sure about the Blue Wizards, based on the essay, the 1954 essay on the Istari. That is, that they're associated with the color blue in some way, and that they went into the east, into the far east, east of Mordor, presumably is what that means. And that's all we know. Now, what do we do with this? And one thing I would mention, by the way, on the side here is I find the last sentence of particular interest. None of these chances were impossible to be, he says, as if anticipating that response, right? People saying, what? The wizard's going bad? I don't know why anyone would be surprised by that, as we've certainly seen Saruman very dramatically going bad, so we should know that that's quite possible. But anyway, for strange indeed though this may seem, the Istari being clad in the bodies of Middle-earth might even as men and elves fall away from their purposes and do evil. And that also seems a little bit odd, because, you know what, based on what we see in the Silmarillion, you don't have to be clad in the bodies of Middle-earth to fall away from your purpose, right? That happened to Sauron, that happened to Morgoth in the first place, to Melkor. So, fleshly incarnation hardly seems a prerequisite for losing sight of your purpose and turning to your own ends. So, both halves of that sentence I find a little bit curious in a way, and one of the things that it kind of leads me to wonder, and I mean that, just to wonder, I don't have any firm views on this, is how Tolkien saw this passage, that is this what Christopher calls the essay on the Istari, how he saw that fitting within the frame. Presumably, since it was originally meant, that is, when he was putting pen to paper on this essay, we are led to understand that he thought this was going to be part of the apparatus of the Lord of the Rings. It was going to be part of the indices of the Lord of the Rings. So, therefore, presumably, it is part of that same Hobbit composition, with or without Gondorian scribal emendations, that the entire Lord of the Rings is sort of, is supposed to be channeled through. And so I'm wondering, just that last sentence really just kind of makes me wonder what sort of framework he had in mind there. That is, from whose point of view, what audience? Because the way that sentence goes, it sounds like it's anticipating an audience reaction, right? For strange indeed though this may seem, right? I'm anticipating that you're going to find this bizarre, and I'm anticipating from the beginning that you're going to be doubtful about what I just said, so I'm going to confirm it. Again, there seems to be a kind of give and take between speaker and hearer, or writer and reader, in that sentence, which makes me wonder exactly who is the writer in question and who are the readers in question. Anyway, so that's one just sort of side note on a curious thing that I find about that. And again, all I can do is assume the answer, which is that it's the same frame as the Lord of the Rings, but we don't really know. If so, it means that the tone of this is supposed to be more speculative. And I think that that's an important thing, as we'll see when we move forward, that is to say that the things uttered in this essay can be taken, at least certainly afterwards, can be easily taken for errors, right? Because there's built into it at least the potential for error and or ignorance. Now, a couple of you were asking about Curanir. Is this the first evidence that that Saruman was going bad? That he was envying people. Is there something? Yana asks, "Is it? Am I the only one who thinks that Saruman returning on his own is very ominous?" Yes, Saruman kind of coming back and being like, "Well, I've dealt with those two upstairs. Oh no, they're busy. Yeah." Yeah, you'll never find the body. I mean, they're, occupied. We probably won't hear from them for a while. you know, we don't know. And it's hard not to think that. And again, one of the things to recall about all of this stuff, and again, this is the same thing that has been true of almost everything that we've been reading, certainly everything we've been reading for the last couple months in Unfinished Tales, is that it's a post-Lord of the Rings thing, right? So we have, we need to retain the Lord of the Rings text in our heads, as we're reading this, because it's building on that. So again, we have Saruman in our heads, right? We know what's going on there. So it's hard not to think that it sounds a little bit ominous. I don't think it need be, but there is a kind of ritually suggestive ambiguity about that fact. First of all, that they're hanging out with him in the first place, and secondly, that he seems to be having something to do with their being sent off like that. Tim asked a good question, and Tim, I have no idea the answer, and that is about the other fact. Why are they blue? Why blue? I don't know, and there are 100 different ways you could go with this. That is to say, if you want to start doing a symbolic analysis of the color blue in Tolkien, you can start drawing in. I mean, there are lots of, I don't doubt that many of you could flood me with suggestions of things that the color blue is associated with over various periods and in certain contexts, and maybe Tolkien knew about that. And I don't know. I mean, there are lots of possibilities like that. The color blue, is significant, has been significant at various points. But I'm never confident in those things. That is, never confident in the absolute relevance of those things. So I myself think the only thing that I would really trust is a trend that's really built up in the text. I had a student once starting to work on a paper on this, and it was too short to be able to really develop it fully, but it would be a little bit interesting to see a list of references, to sort of be seeing what kinds of patterns would emerge from ways in which, things that these different colors are associated with in Tolkien's works themselves. So I don't know. Why brown and gray? No idea. The colors of the wizards. One thing that I think is pretty clear. A very understandable error, and I think it's an error, comes in when Gandalf returns and he's the white now, right? Which leads us as readers very naturally to assume that moving from gray to white was a promotion, right? That white is higher than gray, and so now that he's the white now and no longer the gray, he's been promoted, and from that it's very difficult not to try to sort of expand out from there and see the whole initial color scheme, blue, brown, gray, white, as a ranking system, like martial arts belts in America, right? Like I'm going for my blue robe this year. Like I'm gonna increase. I'm gonna gain a whole bunch of levels, and I'm gonna get my. I mean, I don't think that's the case. I don't even think that that's what's directly meant by Gandalf's changing from gray to white. Remember that when Gandalf is the white, and this is one thing, though I can certainly understand why they did this in the film, one thing they did not represent about Gandalf's visuals, the post-resurrection Gandalf. Remember, he still went covered in a tattered gray cloak, and would sometimes throw it off and then reveal himself in his whiteness. That seems to me the primary difference between Gandalf the Grey and Gandalf the White, is that he turns on the high beams a whole lot more often. Remember in Bag End, in Chapter 1 of the Fellowship of the Ring, when Gandalf threatens that Bilbo might see Gandalf the Grey uncloaked, but he doesn't fully uncloak himself. That is, Gandalf the Grey seems to have gone about, from the beginning, concealing his power. He's not putting forth his power. He's not revealing himself. When he does put forth his power, one of the very few times we actually see Gandalf completely cut loose. And you can tell he completely cuts loose because he identifies himself. He starts naming names, right? And I'm thinking, of course, of the Bridge of Khazad-dûm, when he's facing the Balrog. And he is naming himself. I am the servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor. He's revealing things about himself. He is identifying himself. And what happens when he cuts loose, when he uncloaks himself fully? He glows with a radiant white light, right? He is like this huge sphere of white light. The white is always there, in a sense. But he was previously, in his earlier incarnation, which I think is the technically correct word, as Gandalf the Grey, he was like almost permanently cloaked. It almost never shone through. Now, Gandalf the White seems to have a different sort of set of marching orders, a different way in which he interacts with things and with people. So again, I don't think that this is like he's gained a rank, right? Or even that he's replaced Saruman. So when he says, I am Saruman now, Saruman as he should have been, right? That's not to say, like, I've been promoted into Saruman's place. He had the top ranking, now I have the top ranking, and I'm going to show people what Saruman should have been doing with his time. No, but again, he is now going to fulfill a role which he seems to suggest Saruman should have been fulfilling, and hasn't been fulfilling. So anyway, I think that's... but again, it seems to me entirely understandable and in fact almost inescapable that people would therefore associate the colors with mere promotion and then put brown behind them and then just sort of debate to themselves, which is higher, blue or brown. And again, it seems to me that that's really a missing of the point. Now, I think... But again, why blue? It seems... I don't know. I'm not even going to guess, because here I would be just absolutely... guessing. Chaz is calling me on calling him post-resurrection Gandalf. Yes... Again, technically, reincarnated would be the more accurate word. I think incarnate is exactly what we were told. We'll go over that in a little bit. Is exactly what happens with the wizards. They are spirits. They are Maiar, who are not just embodied in a spirit, that is not just manifested on in the physical world, but incarnated within a body, like elves and men. And so when Gandalf is sent back, he's incarnated again. Reincarnated has different... It's more like a resurrection, I think, than a reincarnation, as we normally... given the associations we normally have with those two words. Gandalf is more like a resurrection, I think, than a reincarnation, which is why I tend to use that word. But Pete, he's reincarnated as himself, except not the same as himself. Again, that's why I think it's confusing to use the word reincarnated, though I think it's more technically accurate. But resurrected, it's quite like the description of resurrection, that is in particular the Christian description of resurrection, because those who come back from the dead are still themselves. That is, their essence in a sense has not changed, as Gandalf's essence has not changed. And yet, like the new Gandalf, the New Testament speaks of the resurrection bodies being and operating quite differently than the old ones did. Anyway, that's why, to me, the word resurrection and what is normally associated with that seems to me to match better with what we see in Gandalf than the word reincarnation and what we usually associate with that. But again, I would agree that technically reincarnation is a more precise description. But absolutely, Sharon and James both, Gandalf 2.0 is how I generally refer to him. Absolutely. But anyway, what else are we going to talk about? Okay, yeah, several of you are mentioning associations, and I think there are lots of associations that we can make. Again, color associations, Radagast with the earth, Gandalf with shadows, or possibly with smoke. I kind of like that, actually, right? It's all about the pipeweed with Gandalf. Kate, I know that's not what you meant, but you're thinking of his association with fire. It's certainly, absolutely. But I'm thinking of the bit in the Hunt for the Ring, the blue wizards with the sea, all very possible. All certainly could be the case. So I would, to me, it quickly becomes. It begins to feel to me very quickly like an exercise in free association, which therefore I kind of question the usefulness of, or the sort of accuracy of. But I don't know. Anyway, let's one more thing here about the Blue Wizards 1.0 before we see them change. Jerry asks, aren't the Blue Wizards mentioned elsewhere in Tolkien's letters? Yes, well, I'm glad you asked that. Of course, in Unfinished Tales, one of his letters is mentioned, and this is clearly from that same period. This is 1958, so it's 4 years after the essay of the Istari was written, but you can see the concept of the Blue Wizard seems to be very similar to the one that he just outlined. In a letter written in 1958, my father said he knew nothing clearly about the other two, since they were not concerned in the history of the northwest of Middle-earth. I think, he wrote, they went as emissaries to distant regions, east and south, far out of Númenórean range, missionaries to enemy-occupied lands, as it were. What success they had I do not know, but I fear that they failed, as Saruman did, though doubtless in different ways, and I suspect they were founders or beginners of secret cults and magic traditions that outlasted the fall of Sauron. Okay, and we see a similar thing here. Again, no names, right? So we got though notice we actually don't even have them being associated with the color blue here, but again, we can sort of, I think, assume that that's stable. But anyway, so even one of the two facts we got before, we don't get anymore. Now we just have the fact that they're going out east, and the possibility, at least, of their failure. Now, one difference here is that 4 years later, he is now at least acknowledging the possibility that they didn't fail, right? That didn't even really seem to be on the table, even though, the potential of it seemed to be recognized in that their failure was not called certain. But he does at least mention, what success they had, I do not know, but I fear they failed, right? That's a slightly different note in his description of their failure. But anyway, we're still sort of expressing the same general idea about the Blue Wizards, and suggesting most likely that they did fail. Let's see. Arthur is asking, is Tolkien therefore linking these failed wizards to Eastern pagan religions? Yes, he is. Secret cults and magic traditions that outlasted the fall of Sauron. Absolutely, yes. Did he have specific ones in mind? I don't know. Kay's asking a similar question. Did Tolkien associate the eastern and southern lands with Africa and Asia? And there, can we follow that lead in linking the Blue Wizards to other religions? Sort of vaguely. I mean, this is something that kind of, to some extent, lost steam over time. I give a much longer answer to this question, and I'll try to restrain myself. As is pretty well known, when Tolkien set out to write his stuff, and I'm talking way at the beginning in the Book of Lost Tales years, he talked later on in retrospect about having wanted to establish a mythology for England, and what that meant back in those days was a much more literal, an indigenous, a fictitious indigenous mythology for not just Britain generally understood, because there's already plenty of Celtic stuff, but England in particular. And the initial stories are very much involved with the kind of mythological explanation of things. And a lot of Tolkien readers don't know this. Tol Eressëa, Elvenhome, was England. And there was even an explanation, it even involved an explanation of how Ireland got separated from the rest of Britain when the island was moved. The whole structure was different. It's not exactly like the later Silmarillion story. You may remember the moving island, right? The floating island that gets pushed around, by which the elves get shipped over to Valinor. It's not that same story exactly, if that's what you're thinking when I was mentioning that. And we don't have time to go into all the details again. We'd have to talk. Somebody would have to elect the Book of Lost Tales in order for us to do that. But anyway, the point is, at the beginning of his conception, the stories of his mythology were very explicitly tied to the soil of England, such that not only land masses, but particular cities and locations within the mythology were identified with modern English cities. That is the earliest conception. As time went on, that kind of got lesser and lesser and vaguer. He does still say that hobbits still linger in places where they used to be, which is in the north and west of the old world, that is to say northwestern Europe, which does lead it. I mean, we know that and there's a lot of discussion in this chapter actually thinking about the Tolkien's long commentaries on Faramir's dictum about Gandalf and his list of names, right? Oloran I was in the west, Incanus in the south, remember all that stuff. So that question of what counts as the north and what is the south and all those things, we can see him sort of thinking through the geography. And there are certainly correlations between the geography of Middle-earth in this way and the geography of the later world, and the idea that Middle-earth is just our world at a previous, at a prehistoric stage, is never completely abandoned. But it gets much, much less precise. I mean, I think that attempting to really identify, historically and geographically identify any of the races in Middle-earth with particular race. I mean, again, we've talked about, I've mentioned several times the whole, Rohirrim and the Anglo-Saxons thing, and Tolkien's famous disclaimer in Appendix F of the Return of the King that, of course, the Rohirrim are not really the Anglo-Saxons. There's no real similarity there. Of course, there's lots of similarity there. But again, does that mean that he's suggesting that the Rohirrim are the ancestors of the Angles and the Saxons in particular? No, I don't think that we see that at all. Rather, what we see is the history of peoples and tongues in Middle-earth as it's represented in its story, in the story that we're given, in the translated story that we're given, modeling or paralleling the development. So we see the people of the Eotheod and the people of Northern Rovanion, who have all of those Gothic names, like Radagast is said to be a Gothic name, no, it doesn't say that. He says it's from the Upper Anduin, which means Gothic, based upon like Vidugavia and all of those names, and then the descendants of those are the Rohirrim, whose language is like Anglo-Saxon, a reflection and a parallel of Tolkien's scholarly belief that that Anglo-Saxon derived from Gothic. But anyway, again, the point is, can we then take that and sort of map this out in some way upon modern countries and modern geography and modern culture, or even historical cultures of those regions, that we're supposed to, that Tolkien is sort of prompting us or inviting us to draw some kind of equivalency, or sort of ancestral descent from, the Rohirrim directly through, the Germanic peoples of no, I really don't think that works. I see very little insistence on that kind of thing. I see very little justification for that within the text itself. I really don't. The cultural differences that he describes, like in his descriptions of the Haradrim, for instance, seem to be based mostly on geography and climate. The sun is very hot there, Gollum tells us. So he describes people who are dressed, who appear and are dressed as more arid desert cultures might be expected to look and dress, because they're from the south, the far south, from far Harad. So, it's I've never found that really a very tenable argument to maintain. It just doesn't really seem to me to hold at all. But again, the links between Middle-earth geography and real-world geography do have deep roots in Tolkien's thinking about his mythology. So it's also not something that can be just kind of flippantly dismissed either. So it's a complicated kind of thing. Okay. Sorry, there's a bunch of other questions here. Okay. Chaz, you were referring ahead to their other names. You're jumping ahead. What I'm trying to do here, and a couple of you are also trying to lure me into talking about their Valinorian names and stuff. Just as I was with Galadriel and Celeborn, I am again here. Don't just mash all those things together, okay? Because they're not all mashed together. It's not enough to take everything that we know about the Blue, everything he said about the Blue Wizards, put it into one pot, and imagine it is like one continuous story of the Blue Wizards. That's not what it is. That's not what happens. They do get names. They'll get two different sets of names, and those two different sets of names suggest very different things about them. But those are later versions of the story. Those are not the same as these Blue Wizards. In fact, their very names suggest that their entire history and story is quite different from this story that we get. So what we have there is not more added detail that we can combine with this, but rather a complete revision, and in the case of the Blue Wizards, I believe, a total of the old story. So this is why I'm trying to be careful in untangling these things, because this is to me one of the things that is most interesting and most profitable when we're reading through chapters like this in Unfinished Tales. That is not the ones which just sort of contain stories which aren't done, but rather which sort of show the development of Tolkien's thought in these ways. And not to mention the fact, if we are ever to go on and do some of the history of Middle-earth together, which a couple of you have suggested that it might be fun to do, I would suggest that we practice this, because we're going to need to get pretty good at that as we go along. Okay. So this is Blue Wizard 1.0. This is the what we see in the 50s, his thoughts about the Blue Wizards. Now we get into what I am calling in tonight's class the Valinorian note, that sort of scrap that Christopher Tolkien talks about, where he talks about the sort of the Valinorian background. What I think is really the most fascinating and tantalizing bit about the wizards that we get. Even more fascinating, I think, than the essay on the Istari that he leads with. The note ends with the statement that Curamo, Saruman, took Iwendil, Radagast, because Yavanna begged him, and that Alatar took Palando as a friend. On another page of jottings, clearly belonging to the same period, it is said that Curamo was obliged to take Iwendil to please Yavanna, wife of Aule.
There are here also some rough tables relating the names of the Istari to the names of the Valar, Oloran to Manwë and Varda, Curamo to Aule, Iwendil to Yavanna, Alatar to Arome, and Palando also to Arome, but this replaces Palando to Mandos and Nienna. And then commentary on this. This is Christopher's commentary on this passage. Whereas in the essay on the Istari it is said that the two who passed into the east have no names, save Ithrin Luin, the Blue Wizards, meaning, of course, that they had no names in the west of Middle-earth, here they are named as Alatar and Palando, and are associated with Orome, though no hint is given of the reason for this relationship. It might be, though this is the merest guess, that Arome of all the Valar had the greatest knowledge of the further parts of Middle-earth, and that the Blue Wizards were destined to journey in those regions and to remain there. All right. Now, notice, compare and contrast Blue Wizards 1.0 with Blue Wizards 2.0. What do we get? Well, we get more facts. We have names, most importantly. This is Tolkien, after all. Names are important, right? So we have names now. We didn't have names before. Before, he was like, I don't know what their names are. They basically didn't have any names. Well, no. Now we get their names. We know what they are called in Valinor. What are, we could say, the original names of the Blue Wizards. Presumably not the names that they are, that they go by. Again, if Gandalf and Saruman are any indication, they'll get lots of names at various points to various people and in various places, but we at least they now have some names to speak of, and that's kind of interesting. We get Paul. You are right to point out we can infer the mission from the associated Valar. Christopher Tolkien's speculation here seems to be, he says it's the merest guess, but it seems to me a very good one. It seems not coincidental that the one thing that we always knew about them, that had been stated about them before, was that they traveled further. They ranged further away than the other three wizards did. So, the association, and so when we combine that with the fact that they're associated with the Valar, who does, himself travel most around Middle-earth, as we learn about Orome in the Silmarillion, that seems uncoincidental. So this seems a good guess on Christopher's part, and that's kind of interesting. How does this help us to fully understand their mission? Well, it's hard to say. I mean, again, we can guess, sort of, based on what we see of Orome, and try to sort of speculate. What are they, hunters? I don't know. But we don't want to take that further than we necessarily can. Any more than the text, of which there is quite little, will really give us warrant for. But okay, so we have good, Sarah, excellent point. Blue Wizards 2.0 don't seem to be influenced by Saruman. This is Sarah Legard, I should say. There are a bunch of Sarahs here tonight. They don't seem to be as influenced by Saruman, but have a destiny to journey. Yes, it's not just that they're led astray. Whatever potential skullduggery Saruman might have been, by implication, associated with in that first depiction, seems not to be the case here. They are quite independent. In fact, Alatar is described not as subordinate. He is one of the original three. So of the five wizards, there are three that primarily are assigned on this journey, and that's Gandalf and Saruman and Alatar, and then Palando goes along with Alatar, and Iwendil, that is to say Radagast, goes along with Saruman. So this puts Alatar, it seems to put Alatar up on, about the same level. Again, indicating that the whole idea of color as rank among the wizards is almost certainly not true. So anyway, it's still not all that much, but it's a great deal more. Roy, actually, you're thinking of the wrong names there. We'll come back to those in a second. Good. John, exactly. John Kingdon says, Orome is the Vala who strikes into enemy territory alone. Yes, remember how he used to make Melkor nervous back in the early days, and how he tried to instill, Melkor, tried to instill fear of the elves into, a solitary rider. John says that seems to be the mission of the Blue Wizards. Yeah, it does. So you'll notice, of course, the other enormously so obvious that nobody's even mentioning it, difference is that there is no indication here of their failure. Now, it's still not ruled out. We don't know for certain that they didn't fail, right? There's no positive statement on which we can really build that. But there's no indication, there's no implication that they actually failed. And that's kind of interesting. 3.0. This comes from his late writing. So we had Christopher Tolkien doesn't give us a date unless I missed it. He doesn't give us a date for this Valinorian note. He places it somewhere in the middle there. So just based on how he placed it, he's doing them roughly in chronological order from the 54 essay, the 1958 letter, and then the later notes, which are in 1972. So somewhere in the 60s, I'm guessing vaguely from the way in which Christopher structured it, but I don't recall that he says directly. But I saw a couple other comments here. Arthur points out that Orome wasn't just the traveler; he was the warrior. Yes, absolutely. He certainly was. I mean, Orome and Tolkas are two of the ones of the Valar who are most fearsome in battle. So yeah, you'd think that the servants of Orome venturing out into the frontiers sounds like a plan, actually. Yeah. Arthur points out the role of wizards, at least in the West, was not military but more inspirational. And may well have been also over there. But again, we can't assume that it's the same everywhere, especially since by definition what they were doing was, to use the phrase used earlier, going out of Númenórean range. They're dealing with a completely different situation. Right? Here we have the remnants of the Dunedain. We have the remnants of the Eldar. We even have some of the Noldor. There's still Calaquendi going around here in the north and west of Middle-earth, where Gandalf and Saruman and Radagast are. That is presumably not the case out in the far east and the far south, where the two blue wizards are going. And so, are they going to, the job of Gandalf might be to go around and stir people to memory, right? To reawaken in them the fire. Alatar and Palando aren't rewaking the fire. They're not rekindling anything. They got to kindle from scratch, right? So, I don't think we should assume that they necessarily carry on the same way that the Western wizards do. But yeah, Jerry asks, why do these wizards go east? But Gandalf says, to the east I go not. We don't know. Was it just their inclination? Was it in their job description? Don't know. We don't know. This passage. That is to say, the Valinorian fragment here. The reason that I find it so intriguing, of the bits about the wizards that we are given here by Christopher Tolkien in this chapter, the Valinorian bit is my favorite one because it is, to me, the most richly suggestive. And Jerry, it's most richly suggestive in exactly that way, by associating these different spirits with these particular Valar. It leads me to speculate about what kind of character they have, what kind of missions they might go on. Again, as we've been doing, given only that one fact that both of them are associated with Orome and that they are sent off into the Far East, discuss amongst yourselves, right? That's a richly suggestive fact. What he was giving us before were mostly negative facts, other than the speculation that they probably failed. That is to say, we don't know their names, and we don't know where they went, and we never heard from them again. Oh, and by the way, they were colored blue, and they went out into the west. But now, we're getting more information to work with, and it's fascinating, I think, to speculate about. Nancy, good question, Nancy. Nancy Fosberg says, the early part of this chapter suggests that there are potentially lots of Istari. The number is unknown, but the chiefs were 5. Is there anything else about the minor wizards? Is it also true later? No idea. It sounds, from the Valinorian fragment, it sounds like Tolkien has abandoned that idea. That he doesn't explicitly say. But it does sound like there are 5 and only 5. Not 5 chief ones and a bunch of other minor ones, but really only 5 that go to Middle-earth. So that seems to be kind of a refinement of the idea. That's Nancy, that's how I read it. That's how I see it, and it may be wrong. Yeah, oh, and Chaz, you're absolutely right. The note about how Tolkien had originally written Palando to Mandos and Nienna, that's even better. I mean, man, you could write a whole essay. Certainly you could write a really interesting short story based on the sole premise: one of the spirits of Orome and one of the spirits of Mandos and Nienna team up and go out into the east among the servants of Sauron to do good for the Valar and the preservation of the children of Iluvatar. What would that look like? What does that mean? Discuss. I mean, that's so fascinating. It's kind of neater to make them, it's more tidy to make them both followers of Orome. But yeah, I love that idea, Chaz. I think that's really fascinating. So there could be, there could be lots of things. Okay. Finally, as I was saying, Wizards 3.0. This is the late stuff now. 1972, this is dated by Christopher Tolkien, so we're talking about the year before Tolkien's death, some of his very, very late writings, just like the very last things. Remember the Galadriel 4.0 story, the story of her and Celeborn, when Celeborn is now a Teleri of Alqualande, and the two of them are sailing independently and have nothing to do with Feanor at all. That sort of stage, in that same time, he's writing this later stuff. And by the way, you'll notice this passage is from Peoples of Middle-earth, which might seem like I'm cheating, but I'm not. Christopher mentions in the lead-in to this passage that in Unfinished Tales he alluded to the fact that there were some other notes which were impossible to decipher. And then he comes back in volume 12 of the History of Middle-earth and says, well, I've been trying for a long time now, and I think I can make out more of that passage that I said 15 years ago was indecipherable, and this is it. So this is the bit that he would have put in. This is the passage he was talking about in Unfinished Tales, and would have put it in Unfinished Tales, but he wasn't confident about his reading of it. But so he puts it in later. So so we're going to talk about it here anyway. The other two came much earlier, at the same time probably as Glorfindel, when matters became very dangerous in the Second Age. Glorfindel was sent to Elrond, and was, though not yet said, preeminent in the war in Eriador. Now go ahead and, while I'm reading, type the stuff, the new facts that we're getting, because again, I want to talk about how are the Blue Wizards 3.0 different, how is their story developed. But the other two Istari were sent for a different purpose. Morenatar and Romastamo, Darkness Slayer and East Helper. Their task was to circumvent Sauron, to bring help to the few tribes of men that had rebelled from Melkor worship, to stir up rebellion, and after his first fall, to search out his hiding, in which they failed, and to cause dissension and disarray. That reflects Christopher being less confident about that he's reading those words properly. And by the way, if you've ever seen Tolkien's handwriting, or a copy of Tolkien's handwriting when he's writing notes fast, it is almost indecipherable. I mean, it barely looks like more than a little wavy line. The difference in Tolkien's handwriting when he's writing his own private notes quickly, and when he's writing, fancy writing. He could do gorgeous calligraphy. But boy, his scratchings when he is just making jottings to himself are maddening to try to deal with. Anyway, to cause dissension and disarray among the Dark East. They must have had very great influence on the history of the Second Age and Third Age in weakening and disarraying the forces of East, who would both in the Second and Third Age otherwise have outnumbered the West. Okay. What do we get? Yes, Arthur. An easy one to overlook, actually, but I think the biggest change of all. The biggest, most profound way in which the story of the wizards has changed here in this later section. All of a sudden, the wizards are Second Age. Absolutely. The other two came much earlier, when matters became very dangerous in the Second Age. So now, the blue wizards are the first ones over. Right? It's, they're not minor, no, they're the first wave of the wizards. They're the advanced team. And they come over in the Second Age. Around the year 1000 of the Third Age is the date agreed upon for the coming of the wizard. Basically agreed upon in almost all the earlier texts, in the appendices of the Lord of the Rings, in the essay on the Istari. All that stuff says about 1000 into the Third Age. Now they're Second Age. What does that mean? What does that show? What does it suggest? What do we see there? It's interesting to hear your thoughts about this. Think about the context now, the historical context of this moment. Remember, the war in Eriador that we're talking about is Sauron's war, the War of the Rings of Power, when Sauron was working with Celebrimbor, and then they had their little falling out, one ring to rule them all, etc., etc., and, Celebrimbor flew off the handle, and Sauron got mad, and, here we go, right? Of course, you recall this, right? So we're talking about Sauron's invasion of Eriador when he sacked Regi, he sacked Hollin, killed Celebrimbor, seized all of the rings of power that he could, but could not find the three, got really mad, besieged Rivendell, was moving out and besieging Lindon out by the coast when the Númenóreans appeared and just absolutely obliterated Sauron's army from there. That is the historical context that we're given for now the Blue Wizards back in the Second Age at that tense moment, that's really the first War of the Ring, right? Which predates both the Battle of the Last Alliance and, of course, the War of the Ring told in the Lord of the Rings. The first War of the Rings was a pretty tense time and pretty near to disaster for the free peoples of Middle-earth. In that time and in that moment, the Blue Wizards are sent, and they're sent out into the East. This is where several of you have been wanting to talk about the meanings of their names. This is where, in 1972, is where we get the meanings of their names: Mora Natar and Romastamo, Darkness Slayer and East Helper. This is a dramatic difference. Not only do they have names which show us their activities. And again, thinking back to our previous conversation about the implications of them being followers of Arome, and what does this mean about how they might possibly have operated or been supposed to be operating out in the East, this is much more explicit. Darkness Slayer? That's pretty aggressive, right? Very different. Again, several of you were sort of saying, "Hey, the wizards in the West are not, they're not taking military action." No, but kind of sounds like the Blue Wizards might have been. Darkness Slayer, and it could be figurative, right? Doesn't mean that they're generals, right, or they're warriors or anything like that necessarily. You can slay darkness without fighting. You could call Gandalf Darkness Slayer in his healing of Theoden, perhaps. But there are different ways that you can take that, but still it's very active. And they have they have, as who was it that was saying this? Carolyn, as Carolyn was saying, they have a specific brief instead of just heading out east. Yeah, we're told why they were headed out east, and not only does it not say that they failed, as it did the first time, not only does it leave open the possibility of their success, as the second one does, it explicitly says that they did succeed. Not completely, right? One of their jobs was to seek out Sauron in his hiding. That is, when Sauron is almost destroyed, in the War of the Last Alliance, when Isildur cuts the ring from his hand and his spirit flees, apparently it was the Blue Wizard's job to try to find where the greatly reduced spirit of Sauron was hiding, and they didn't find him. They missed him. So their success was not perfect, but boy, the War of the Ring would have gone differently if they had not been there, right? So in fact, the note that gets struck here, though again, it's so much less full. He's not even using complete sentences here. These are just notes which Christopher Tolkien, in the early 80s couldn't even understand, right? That is, he couldn't even read it. But nevertheless, the kind of story that we get here, it strikes a note which sounds to me very similar to the note that we get at the end of Appendix A. That is, the passage in Appendix A, which is all that is left of what was originally the Quest of Erebor, right? The discussion between Gandalf and Frodo and Gimli in Minas Tirith. The bit that's left in the appendix, remember, where Gandalf says, as we celebrate the victory here, let us not forget the contributions made by other people. Let us not forget, Dan and King Bran fighting in Dale. Let us not forget the Battle of the Woods, right, where Celeborn did something, and Thranduil. Let's not forget that, right? And now, retroactively, in 1972, we seem to have, and also, give it up for the Blue Wizards out in the East, right? Let us not forget that had it not been for those two Blue Wizards out there, we wouldn't have stood a chance in the War of the Ring. Boy, they would have been drawing on the military might of an entire continent, probably several times larger than the entire west of Middle-earth, had they not been thwarted by those Blue Wizards out there. So, that is an enormous change. As I said, the story of the Blue Wizards, though very short, is a very dramatic one in how it's changing. And they're Chad, they're combating the reappearance of Sauron after his destruction, when he loses the ring. That's my understanding of that. That is, it starts off in that period of the war in Eriador, but they're there throughout, right? So that one of the things that they're doing is when Sauron flees, they're trying to find him, and they're trying to combat his gaining of power again. Remember all those references in the Lord of the Rings to how the East is moving, right? The East is all mobilized when Sauron returns. Well, yeah, but that's only a fraction of what he would have been able to do. It also suggests, of course, and again, getting back to the first observation that you made, the arrival of the Blue Wizards in the Second Age is fascinating because it alters the concept, significantly alters the concept of what the wizards were up to, or rather what the Valar were up to in sending the wizards in the first place. And it's, to me, a very interesting change. You think about, sort of step back, and you think about the history of the relationship between the Valar and Middle-earth, right? You get lots of stuff in the First Age, but in particular, we get that sort of standoff, almost, how the Valar have separated themselves, and when the Noldor go back, they don't, it takes Eärendil returning to get them to intervene again at the end of the First Age. Before that, they're not, except for Ulmo, who, as he explained in Chapter 1 of Unfinished Tales, can't be bothered. He's the fly in the ointment for the Valar, and by golly, he's going to keep interfering in Middle Earth, and nobody can tell him he can't. But most of the Valar aren't doing that directly anymore until the end comes, and the moment comes when they intervene dramatically at the end of the First Age. In the Third Age, we get the Istari, but the Second Age was primarily the age of Númenor. That is, the interactions that we get from the Valar, there was no indication of a clear, direct intervention to Middle-earth itself by the Valar. We see the Númenorians engaging with them in various ways. Right, first the dramatic intervention by the Valar in the aftermath of the War of Wrath, in the establishment of Númenor and the bringing of the Edain to the Island of Gift. And then you've got the whole ban of the Valar, and ultimately the attack on the Valar and the destruction of them. So you've got this sort of Númenor focus on the Valar. Are the Valar even paying attention to Middle-earth? None of those stories suggested. Well, here in 1972, Tolkien is suggesting it, and he's projecting it. Back then. And Chaz, no, I don't think that we're necessarily supposed to understand that when they were sent in the Second Age, they had a to-do list, which included, like, when a couple thousand years from now Sauron is nearly destroyed, track him down and try to prevent him from reestablishing power. But rather that these are the things that they do, the jobs that they get over the course of the time, that having projected their arrival, having moved their arrival backwards, back into the middle of the Second Age, rather than into the middle of the Third Age. He then goes on to say, being in Middle-earth during that time, what would they do? Well, of course, had Gandalf been around, not only, it's sort of an interesting question, right? Had Gandalf been there at the War of the Last Alliance, what would have happened? Well, he probably would have spoken more abusively to Isildur on Mount Doom, right? Throw it in, you fool! But anyway, besides that, we certainly, given Gandalf's actions in the latter half of the Third Age, one would imagine that the first thing on the mind of somebody like Gandalf would have been, Sauron isn't destroyed, he's not dead, so let's track him down and find him and see if we can prevent him from regaining shape. Again, based on what Gandalf actually does do in the second half of the Third Age, that would seem, in fact, the quite logical thing for a second to early Third Age wizard to do. So, he says, that's what the Blue Wizards do, in fact. They didn't totally succeed at that, but hey, they tried. Kevin asks, couldn't the lack of intervention by the Valar in the Second Age simply be our ignorance of it because of how the focus of most writings in the Second Age are from a Númenorian perspective? Kevin, yes, I think so. And what's more, I think that categorically the understanding or the belief of people in Middle-earth that the Valar are uninterested in Middle-earth or don't pay attention to it or don't intervene in it at all, I think says more about the ignorance of the people of Middle-earth about the Valar than it says about the ambivalence of the Valar towards Middle-earth. So, Kevin, I absolutely agree with you there. Okay. So that's the Blue Wizards. As I said, I'm just going to say a couple things about the Blue Wizards at the beginning of class, and then we're going to really get on to what I mostly want to talk about today, since, class is almost over. But let's go back and review some of the stuff we've already talked about and some of these things we can get through relatively quickly. And again, the reason I wanted to start with the Blue Wizards is I think it establishes the pattern really interestingly and most dramatically. Let's look at the description. This is now back in the 1954 essay to the description of the nature of the Istari. Emissaries they were from the lords of the West, the Valar, who still took counsel for the governance of Middle-earth, and when the shadow of Sauron began first to stir again, took this means of resisting him. For with the consent of Eru, they sent members of their own high order, but clad in bodies as of men, real and not feigned, but subject to the fears and pains and weariness of earth, able to hunger and thirst and be slain, though because of their noble spirits they did not die, and aged only by the cares and labors of many long years. Obviously, that's he's not contradicting himself there. When he says they did not die, he means they did not die of old age, but they can, of course, be slain. If you stick a sword through Gandalf's head, he will die. Or if, you, throw him into a chasm and then make him climb up a whole lot of stairs and then beat him down with a whip and whatever else the conflict between him and the Balrog consisted of up on top of the mountain. Anyway, he could die if that happens. Or if he's dropped from the claws of an eagle, right? Do not let me fall, says Gandalf. Anyway, he can be slain, but he doesn't die of old age, and aged only by the cares and labors of many long years. Note here Tolkien making a reference back to remember, I've said several times how Tolkien is a very careful reader of his own writing, right? And you can often hear places where he is kind of pointing back to allusions that have been made during the course of the Lord of the Rings text. One of the things here that we get is we see, at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring, Frodo perceives that Gandalf has aged. When there's 9 years between the times that he sees Gandalf for the first time in 9 years, he thinks he looks older, more careworn. Right? Not dramatically older. He's not aging before his eyes, but he does alter. He does not have an ageless, immortal appearance. So, Tolkien is telling us that that's generally true of the Istari. And this the Valar did, desiring to amend the errors of old, especially that they had attempted to guard and seclude the Eldar by their own might and glory fully revealed, whereas now their emissaries were forbidden to reveal themselves in forms of majesty, or to seek to rule the wills of men or elves by open display of power, but coming in shapes weak and humble, were bidden to advise and persuade men and elves to good, and to seek to unite in love and understanding all those whom Sauron, should he come again, would endeavor to dominate and corrupt. Okay. Here's where we get things that we mentioned before, that is, the fact that the wizards do not just have a feigned body, to use the word, that it's not just a fake body. We know that the Valar, we're told in the Valaquenta, that the Valar can manifest themselves in physical form. They can choose to appear to the children of Iluvatar in physical forms, but that's not their real selves. That's an appearance that they put on themselves in order to make it easier for them to interact with the people of Middle-earth. So it is in that sense a feigned appearance on their part. The Istari are given real, not feigned bodies. They are actually incarnated in flesh. Not only are they subject to the fears and pains and weariness of earth, but Christopher Tolkien suggests in his commentary soon after this that they are limited by the brains and the experience that they have. That is, they don't automatically know and remember all of the things that they knew from Valinor. They are not just the immortal spirits operating, but now operating in a new body. They seem to be limited by their body. Their knowledge seems to be limited to their new body. This is something that I think that we can see as a... So again, I think there are some passages of the Lord of the Rings that we can hear behind that idea. In particular, the times when Gandalf speaks as if he's had to learn all these things. One of the moments that jumps out at me as an illustration is when he's riding with Pippin on Shadowfax, galloping towards Minas Tirith after Pippin has looked in the Palantir. And he, Gandalf, is reciting rhymes of lore, right? As if he has to use these mnemonic devices made by human scholars, right, in the Third Age to help them remember things which otherwise are obscure and might be lost. And it's like Gandalf, and remember Gandalf's comment about the Palantir. He's like, maybe you could see the unimaginable hand and mind of Feanor at work. And it's easy to say if you think about it and be like, what do you mean, the unimaginable hand and mind of Feanor? Can't you imagine it again? Didn't you know Feanor? Didn't you used to pass Feanor on the street in Valinor at some point? I mean, seriously. In what way is it unimaginable to you? Well, he doesn't know. He doesn't remember that. So anyway, I think that's one of the things that we are that we're reminded of about them, that their incarnation is real. The limitation of their power when they go to Middle-earth, what they are volunteering for, the limitation that they volunteer for, is much more profound than, say, Eonwe when he's leading the armies of the Valar in the War of Wrath. He does not seem to be operating under the same kinds of limitations. But anyway. Okay, the other thing... What was the other thing? Oh yeah, the business about open displays of power. That they can't do this. One general trend that I would point to. Remember the context of this. 1954. This was designed to be part of the apparatus of the Lord of the Rings. It is, therefore, inescapably, far more Lord of the Rings-centric than his later writings of it. Of course, when he's writing in 1972 and he's jotting down notes in 1972 about the career of the Blue Wizards, he's making stuff up that he didn't feel free to make up in the 1950s. That he always wasn't comfortable doing. You'll notice the emphasis here seems to be like the stuff about the Druidon that we were talking about. The example I was using last time about how we see all these things about Han-Buri-Khan. We get all these references to the Pukelman and the Path of the Dead and all these other ancient things. And Tolkien is taking those things and kind of fitting them together, moving them forward a little bit, developing them in some different ways, incorporating, in some ways, kind of synthesizing elements. We talked about the tall guy, the tall king my gateway droog from last time, right? Who has almost every characteristic of a droog as described in that chapter, except that he's described as tall in The Lord of the Rings, right? So, and again, there I think we can see Tolkien assimilating these things and putting them together. Here, in this essay, 1954, the description of the wizards sounds primarily like a setup for Gandalf and Saruman, that it's primarily talking about Gandalf and Saruman. Open display of power, to rule the will. Yeah, they're not allowed to seek to rule the wills of men or elves by open display of power. Not that we're thinking of anybody in particular when we say that. But instead, they should be they're coming in shapes weak and humble and are bidden to advise and persuade men and elves to good. Not that we're thinking of anybody in particular. I mean, it's like that passage is transparently talking about Saruman and Gandalf, right? This is, in a sense, merely generalizations that are being made from the careers of those two things. Again, this is more of a kind of a marginal commentary on the Lord of the Rings stuff than it is him telling us what really lay behind that, right? It's him kind of connecting things together a little bit. Later on, he is going to choose to take their stories in different ways. But here we see him wanting to explain, to sort of fit together and make into a clear and coherent package what we see about wizards in the Lord of the Rings, and to emphasize the things that get emphasized in the Lord of the Rings, and in particular, the great role that Gandalf plays. And that's what a lot of the essay focuses on. Círdan's greatest act is his discernment of Gandalf, right? "For," said he, "great labours and perils lie before you, and lest your task prove too great and wearisome, take this ring for your aid and comfort. It was entrusted to me only to keep secret, and here upon the west shores it is idle. But I deem that in days ere long to come it should be in nobler hands than mine, that may wield it for the kindling of all hearts to courage." And the grey messenger took the ring, and kept it ever secret. Yet the white messenger, who was skilled to uncover all secrets, after a time became aware of this gift and begrudged it, and it was the beginning of the hidden ill will that he bore to the grey, which afterwards became manifest. Okay, so this is Círdan. Now, keep in mind, in the context of this, the emphasis just in the previous paragraph here was on how most people thought that Saruman was the greater of the two, that he was greater than Gandalf. In fact, even many of the Eldar made that mistake. This helps to explain why Saruman won the election, right? Why he got appointed head of the council instead of Gandalf. We know that Galadriel was in the pro-Gandalf, was stumping for Gandalf in the council election. But Saruman won, and a question, I forget how this came up, but I remember us talking about it before. Maybe it was in Riddles in the Dark, actually, I don't remember. The question was, how did Saruman ever become head of the council in the first place? Well, he addresses that here, right? That even among the wise, even among the Eldar, there were lots of people who genuinely believed that Saruman was greater than Gandalf. That's what's important about this, is that Círdan sees through it, right? He is the one who, from the beginning, perceives that Gandalf is the true power, that his is the most worthy and the greatest, role in nature among them, and so he gives him the ring, which he says he's just been holding. He's just that he's been holding it as a placeholder. So again, notice how in this text, Tolkien has explained a question that we had when we were looking at things earlier on. That is, why would you give a ring of power to Círdan? I think this was wasn't this in the end of the Return of the King class, or was it in the Silmarillion Seminar Reunion episode? I can't remember which one it was, but we were talking about, like, why do you give Círdan the ring of fire? That seems really funny. Well, Tolkien explains here. Oh no, it was he was just a caretaker. At least he thought of himself only as a caretaker of it. But notice, as Gerald, yes, as you're emphasizing, that we are told here that Saruman ultimately fell because of jealousy, that he didn't get the ring from Círdan, and went seeking a ring of his own. Yeah, Gerald. I mean, now remember, we've been doing lots of Gandalf and Saruman stuff, right? We saw that in the Battles of the Fords of Isen. We saw that, of course, much more in the Hunt for the Ring. We've gotten lots of Gandalf and Saruman material. This essay predates that stuff. Okay, so this is a precursor to this is before Tolkien went on to write the smoke ring confrontation, for instance, between Gandalf and Saruman. So his conception of the arising of the jealousy and the rivalry between Saruman and Gandalf gets more elaborated over time. But here we're told that this again, Gerald, I do link it back to what we see again in the Lord of the Rings, right? That Saruman begrudges anybody who, quote, schemed for Gandalf's part, right? Thinking of the accusation he levels against Galadriel at the end of the Return of the King. He gets angry at anybody who schemes for Gandalf, and in particular seems to have some serious ring envy. Right, he's going to make a ring of power for himself to dominate the other rings of power, because, darn it, he's the only one who doesn't have a ring of power. So again, this so much of this essay seems to be designed to sort of connect the dots and fill in the holes about wizards that we get in the Lord of the Rings. And again, that makes sense, as that's what it was. And Faye, you're absolutely right. That's an excellent point. Faye says, but Tolkien emphasizes the begrudging and not the ring per se as the cause of the downfall. Yes, absolutely. It's the begrudging. It's the motivation. That the fall is not certainly externally forced upon him. Anyway, so what was Gandalf up to? But the last comer was named among the elves Mithrandir, the grey pilgrim, for he dwelt in no place, and gathered to himself neither wealth nor followers, but ever went to and fro in the westlands from Gondor to Angmar, and from Lindon to Lorien, befriending all folk in times of need. Warm and eager was his spirit, and it was enhanced by the ring Narya, for he was the enemy of Sauron, opposing the fire that devours and wastes with the fire that kindles and succours in wan hope and distress. Can I just say, how awesome is it to think back on Gandalf's Shire fireworks display in this light, right? Thinking about him as the fire that kindles and succors in wan hope and distress. I mean, if that doesn't make you see Gandalf's fireworks displays in a new light, I don't know what will. But his joy and his swift wrath were veiled in garments grey as ash. See, this is where I'm getting that link between the greyness and the veiling, right, that I mentioned before. So that only those that knew him well glimpsed the flame that was within. Merry he could be, and kindly to the young and simple, and yet quick at times to sharp speech and the rebuking of folly. But he was not proud, and sought neither power nor praise. And thus far and wide he was beloved among all those that were not themselves proud, like Faramir. Mostly he journeyed unwearyingly on foot, leaning on a staff, and so he was called among the men of the north Gandalf, the elf of the wand. For they deemed him, though in error, as has been said, to be of elven kind, since he would at times work wonders among them, loving especially the beauty of fire, and yet such marvels he wrought mostly for mirth and delight, and desired not that any should hold him in awe, or take his counsels out of fear. Okay. Yeah, Sarah, exactly. Gandalf's fireworks as mentioned from the first pages of The Hobbit. Yeah, exactly. Going back to page 4 of The Hobbit and Bilbo's memory of the fireworks displays at the old Tooks parties. Absolutely. Again, not only is Tolkien a great reader of his own work, but the way in which he can do this stuff. I talked about this a little bit with the Druidon last time, but the way in which he can sort of take something and not change it exactly, but recontextualize it in a way which makes us see it in an entirely different light from then on. It's that's pretty amazing. So here's Gandalf. This is the sort of backstage view of Gandalf's career. The emphasis of how great Gandalf was and who he was and what he accomplished comes at a price, though. This is, of course, the time when the Blue Wizards are being dismissed. I don't even know what their names are, but they probably failed, right? And Saruman, of course, doesn't ever come off looking well, but of course, there's somebody else who gets thrown under the bus, too. Poor Radagast. Indeed, of all the Istari, only one only remained faithful, and he was the last comer. For Radagast, the fourth, became enamored of the many beasts and birds that dwelt in Middle-earth, and forsook elves and men, and spent his days among the wild creatures. Thus he got his name, which is in the tongue of Numenor of old, and signifies, it is said, tender of beasts. In his footnote to that passage, Christopher Tolkien gives the alternative meaning of Radagast not as a Numenorian name, but as a name in the tongue of the people of Northern Rovanian. Again, that sort of quasi-Gothic tongue that they use, and says that its meanings are obscure. Radagast. Radagast is a failure. Why is Radagast a failure? Because he went native, apparently. He became enamored of the many beasts and birds that dwelt in Middle-earth, and that's bad? Well, no. Forsaking elves and men, that's bad. He spent his days among the wild creatures. This is hard. That sentence, I find that sentence uncomfortable. The reason I find it uncomfortable is when I do with it the same thing we were just doing with Gandalf, right? That is, taking the way that he's kind of bringing these things together and summing them up, and then you go back and you look at what was said in The Lord of the Rings in the light of what Tolkien said, in these other things. When I do that here, it doesn't work out very well. The obvious passage to refer to, and I didn't have this typed, but I'm in the Council of Elrond here, Gandalf's recounting of his trip to Isengard and his meeting with Radagast. Gandalf, of course, says, Radagast is, of course, a worthy wizard, a master of shapes and changes of hue, and he has much lore of herbs and beasts, and birds are especially his friends. Gandalf certainly seems to speak of with no disdain of those things. Saruman does, of course, calling him scathingly Radagast the bird tamer. But of course, Gandalf has the last laugh there, as with the intervention of the bird, the eagle, who takes Gandalf away. Remember Frodo's song of lamentation for Gandalf in Lorien, which isn't exactly a song of lamentation exactly, but anyway, a sort of encomium of Gandalf, and he mentions that, with bird on bough and beast in glen, in their own secret tongues he spoke. Right? Gandalf is also has much lore of herbs and beasts, and is the friend of birds. That too we see from The Hobbit moving forward. Gandalf's words about Radagast being the friend of birds does not make it sound like a bad thing. It's hard. This is hard for me to reconcile. Robert, you're right. Of course, Saruman does tame birds too with the crabine, right? But anyway, when I take this passage and I compare it back to the reference in the main text of the body of the Lord of the Rings, it doesn't seem to shed more light on it. It seems to confuse the issue. Gandalf clearly praises Radagast. Gandalf clearly admires Radagast for his relationship with beasts and birds. Even apart from the fact that Radagast's relationship with birds pulls Gandalf's biscuits out of the fire pretty soon after this, right? So the fact that he's now saying in the later apparatus of the Lord of the Rings that Radagast failed, and his failure consisted in his excessive devotion to, his excessive enamorment with beasts and birds. It's hard. I find those two passages really hard to reconcile. Now, how do I understand this? Roy is asking, and it's a good question, do we have any idea who the narrator is here? Is it simply Tolkien? Remember, Roy, this is the same thing I was asking about that same question before, that there seems to be a speaker in an audience, and so I'm certainly willing to believe that there's some kind of frame issue going on here in this text, but that doesn't seem to me to be exclusively the explanation of things here. That is to say, the overall thrust of the essay on the Istari is praise of Gandalf. That, if I had to take the entire essay and kind of sum up or say, what do I think the main point of this essay is? What really seems to be the message that it is hammering home about the Istari? I would say the greatness of Gandalf. And, that what you're to take from this is the significance of Gandalf's role. And so we elevate Gandalf to the exclusion of the Blue Wizards entirely, at the expense of Radagast, and suggesting that Saruman's enmity and envy of Gandalf was the root of his problem way back when they started projecting backwards, the beginning of Saruman's decline, and making his envy of Gandalf the root of it. So again, the whole thing becomes extremely Gandalf-centric here in the essay on the Istari. That, of course, is much less true when we get into the Valinorian note. Who would go? For they must be mighty, peers of Sauron, but must forego might and clothe themselves in flesh, so as to treat on equality and win the trust of elves and men. So notice already we have a kind of a bias in Gandalf's favor, right? We already, it's already been emphasized. One of the things that we've seen emphasized about Gandalf in the text of the Lord of the Rings, in the earlier essay on the Istari, is that Gandalf did the cloaking thing better, right? That he more successfully forgoes might, certainly, than Saruman, though that's a pretty low standard. But anyway, he does that very well, the foregoing of might and the limiting of himself. But this would imperil them, dimming their wisdom and knowledge and confusing them with fears, cares, and weariness coming from the flesh. But only two came forward. Notice that now this is Christopher summarizing what the note says. But only two came forward, Kuramo, who was chosen by Aule, and Alatar, who was sent by Orome. By the way, this is another one of those moments when Christopher Tolkien's editorial practice, though I don't doubt that it produced a smoother final product, it makes me want to say, give us the whole thing. Please just give us the text and then explain it later if you want to, but don't paraphrase, please, if you can possibly help it. Anyway, sorry. I'm okay. Deep breaths. But two only came forward, Kuramo, who was chosen by Aule, and Alatar, who was sent by Orome. Then Manwë asked, where was Olorin? And Olorin, who was clad in grey, and having just entered from a journey, had seated himself at the edge of the council, asked what Manwë would have of him. Manwë replied that he wished Olorin to go as the third messenger to Middle-earth, and it is remarked in parentheses that Olorin was a lover of the Eldar that remained, apparently to explain Manwë's choice. But Olorin declared that he was too weak for such a task, and that he feared Sauron. Then Manwë said that it was all the more reason why he should go, and that he commanded Olorin, illegible words follow that seem to contain the word third, but at that Varda looked up and said, not as the third, and Kuramo remembered it. Yeah. Oh, Chaz is asking, are there peers of Sauron and the Valar sent 5? How is that a fair fight? Peers doesn't mean they're exactly equal to him. They're peers of him in the same way that, all of the Valar are peers of Morgoth. That doesn't mean that they could beat Morgoth in a fair fight one-on-one, each one of them. That's demonstrably untrue. Morgoth, in his beginnings, was greater than all of them. But they are still his peers as far as where they are in the larger sense of the hierarchy. That's how I understand that reference there. That is, just as Sauron is a Maiar, so those that are sent against him are to be Maiar also. That doesn't mean they're exactly in his weight class. Brian says, I feel like Varda is having a Melian moment. Yeah, you kind of wonder where she gets that, right? You can see sort of the... in this sense, Galadriel is like the spiritual grandmother of Varda, right? She got it from Melian, and Melian seems to have gotten it from Varda. Anyway, anyhow, so what do we see here? Olorin being singled out. So again, we have Gandalf in an exalted position, though exalted ironically for being humble. Right? We see how retiring he is. We also see that he wears grey even back in Valinor. We see his unwillingness to put himself forward. This shows that he is the perfect candidate. Olorin declares that he's too weak for such a task, and that he feared Sauron. Nolo episcopari, says Gandalf. I do not want to be bishop. That's how you know. It's a medieval Catholic thing. How do you know when somebody is correct to be put in a position of leadership in the church? When they don't want it. That shows. If they really want a position of authority, that shows that you really should not give it to them. Which, by the way, I think is and Tolkien in one of his letters quoted that Latin phrase "nolo episcopari" in a political context, saying that the only people who should be leaders, in the modern political world, equally, are people who don't want it. So anyway, we see Gandalf really passing that test here, and Manwë explicitly saying his humility and lack of desire for dominion and the lack of wanting to be in the spotlight is all the more reason why he should go. By contrast, Kuramo jumps forward right away. He is the first volunteer. So again, we see not necessarily Saruman's fall extending all the way back. This is not to say that Saruman was already bad at heart, right? But that we can see the potential of fall in him, just as even before the music of the Ainur, we can see some warning signs in Melkor, right? So too we see warning signs here in Saruman. And I forget who it was way earlier, like near the very beginning of class. One of you, no, I don't think it was, I can't remember who it was asking about, what is it with Aule and the people of Aule, that they seem to go, Sauron is one of the people of Aule. This, I just go back here to the whole, the problem with sub-creators. The problem with sub-creators is, we see this from the beginning. The more sub-creative you are, the greater the danger of finding. This was Feanor's problem, right? Sauron's problem, Morgoth's problem. They were makers, and there's temptation involved in that. And Arthur, yes, Aule too. Aule too stumbled. He didn't fall, but he stumbled, right? And has to be sort of rebuked by Iluvatar. So yeah, there is a clear trend of that. Those who are like, the more like Iluvatar you are, the more that this sort of that making impulse, that thinking of Tolkien's poem Mythopoeia, being made in the image of a maker. The more that is true of you, the more dangerous it can be, the more likely it would be that you could fall, that you would use that power for your own elevation, for your own glorification, as Melkor did during the music. So that's a piece that makes all kinds of sense, right? That's sort of the least surprising identification. But of course, there's more, right? There's Radagast, whose name means bird lover, who is coming from Yavanna. Now, Christopher Tolkien is very shy about this. He says, I didn't quote it for you, but he says, the identification of Radagast with Yavanna doesn't seem to be quite in keeping with what was said in the essay on the Istari about how he, was too enamored of birds and beasts. That it's kind of hard to imagine one of the Maya of Yavanna failing because they paid too much attention to herbs and beasts and birds. Why would this be right? And Neil, exactly, if his name was Bird Lover in the beginning, how could he have strayed by loving birds too much? Yeah. Again, Christopher is very cautious. He's very diffident in talking about these two passages. I myself would go much, much further than Christopher Tolkien does and say that this is a flat contradiction. In fact, I would even go so far as to say it sounds almost like a correction of the previous passage. That here, to me, the clearest way to describe this would be a change of mind on Tolkien's part. To me, this amounts almost as a retraction of that previous thing. Tom says, "Love not too much the birds on your hand." Yeah, or under your hat, perhaps. But yes, I think that this is a real shift. And now we're never told whether or not Radagast, after the clear statement that he failed in the earlier version, we're never told that he succeeds later on, but his downfall is not repeated. That is, the assertion of his failure is not reiterated after that. But the fact that the cause or the explanation of his failure seems to me to be retracted in these later writings is, to me, pretty suggestive that perhaps we are being invited to reconsider the possibility of Radagast's failure, though so little is said about him later on. Another passage from the late notes from the 1972 texts. "We must assume that they, the Istari, were all Maiar, that is, persons of the angelic order, though not necessarily of the same rank. The Maiar were spirits, but capable of self-incarnation, and could take humane, especially elvish forms." Now, does this mean that he's retracting what he said before about their being fully incarnated in bodies, or is he now just imagining, is he rethinking that now and saying that they're self-incarnated in the sense in which all the Maiar and Valar can embody themselves in humane, especially elvish forms? That begins to sound more like what the rest of the Valar and the Maiar do, and to make their case a little bit less special. I'm not 100% sure that that's what he's pushing for here, but it seems like that's possible, that he was maybe reconsidering that. Saruman is said, e.g. by Gandalf himself, to have been the chief of the Istari, that is, higher in Valinorian stature than the others. Gandalf was evidently in the next in order. Radagast is presented as a person of much less power and wisdom. Doesn't say he fails, just that he is a person of much less power and wisdom. He is a lesser spirit, of course. All Maya are not created equal. Some are greater and more powerful and more wise than others. So now notice this is a revision, or perhaps a clarification, of the earlier point. Remember, back in the essay on the Istari, it suggested from the beginning that Gandalf was the greatest. That's what Círdan perceived, right? Ah, you're the one. I'm going to give you the ring, right? Gandalf was always the greatest. Saruman always resented that, and that was kind of where the trouble began. But most people didn't recognize it because Gandalf was so successfully humble and Saruman was so unsuccessfully humble. Everybody thought that Saruman was the greatest, but really Gandalf was the greatest, right? Here, that's being explained. And in truth, it's another one of those passages in the essay on the Istari that does not fit perfectly with what we get in The Lord of the Rings. Gandalf himself says that Saruman is the greatest of his order, right? Is the chief of his order, that Saruman is greater than he is. Now, Gandalf is very humble, yes, but to be humble is one thing. To lie is another. If Gandalf is going to say untruthfully that Saruman is greater than he, that doesn't seem to fit with the rest of what we see in Gandalf's character. So how would Gandalf's true superiority being unperceived by everybody, that helps to explain why Saruman came to be head of the council, but it doesn't explain Gandalf's attitude towards him. Here in 1972, he goes back and he adds a wrinkle that does explain it, right? In Valinorian stature, back in Valinor, Cúramo is a greater spirit than Olorin. Cúramo, in some sense that we don't fully understand and isn't fully explained, outranked Olorin back in Valinor. And therefore, when Gandalf speaks of him, he says quite truly, he's the head of my order. He's greater than I am. He has greater stature than any of the rest of us who came over on the boat. But though still, presumably, the change in the discrepancy in perception that everybody believes Saruman to be greater, though not everybody, such as Círdan and Galadriel, still seems to hold true. But again, notice Radagast no longer a complete failure. I am out of time. Let me hustle through these. I won't read this last one to you. This passage is focused primarily on the elves and how they've diminished, and how Legolas probably achieved least of the 9 walkers. Don't tell Orlando Bloom. But anyway, the thing about Gandalf here that's most important is the last sentence. Among them, Gandalf, who proved to be the director and coordinator both of attack and defense. So we see Gandalf still here in charge of all of these things. And I'll come back to this one. I'll come back to this one next time. I don't want to rush over this one because this one is really cool. We'll talk about Gandalf and Manwë more tomorrow, during tomorrow's session. So let me just, at the end here, kind of sum up. I've made a little chart here looking at the development of this idea because I want to back up and look at the big picture here. I've broken it into 3 basic stages that we get in this chapter from the 54 essay on the Istari, the Valinorian note of somewhere in between, and his late notes in 1972. And to sort of step back and look at the progression of all 4 of these, lumping the 2 blue wizards together into one category. And starting with them, notice with them we get, as I said, the most dramatic trajectory. No name, no business, no precious. No name, no business. In 1954, they seem to be implied to have a purpose, and we learn a little bit more about them through their linking with Orome in the Valinorian note. And then in the late notes, not only are they clearly heroes, but they're heroes of the Second Age. They're longer standing. So they're the senior wizards in Middle-earth. So we see the role of the blue wizards dramatically increasing, though we still never learn much in the way of details. But still, the concept, the story of the Blue Wizards grows and grows over time. Radagast, his story doesn't grow. If anything, he peters out and almost completely vanishes. And that seems to me, again, given what I see as almost a retraction in the Yavanna stuff of what he said in the essay, the fact that he's almost completely absent later on, I don't know if he intended to go and write a big Radagast clarification, or if he wrote that in some other notes that we haven't been given by Christopher Tolkien, but the sort of the silence about Radagast later on, and the fact that his disappearance is not, or not, his failure rather, is not reasserted, is to me suggestive that his story is, he was kind of, as I said, sort of thrown under the bus in the essay on the Istari, and he's being not dramatically altered in the way that the Blue Wizards are, but at least kind of recuperated a little bit over time. And then with Gandalf and Saruman, we see the refinement of their story. Their fundamental story doesn't change, but it comes to fit the text better and better. And with each iteration, we get more and more insight into the fundamental dynamics that we see between Gandalf and Saruman. That is, Gandalf's power, but his humility, and Saruman's greater power, but his much greater pride and arrogance, and his consequent envy of Gandalf. So anyway, that's just sort of a little overview. Let us. So we'll reconvene tomorrow afternoon. If you can join me tomorrow at 4:00 p.m. Eastern Time, we will. I want to touch on my one last slide there, and then we'll go and look at some Palantiri stuff. I again encourage you, if you have questions that you would like to answer. I've got a couple that have been sent in already, but not all that many actually. So I would welcome more questions. This is our last chance to talk about the Unfinished Tales. Like ever, I'll never talk about Unfinished Tales again. Okay, that's probably not true. But this is the end of the Unfinished Tales class. So if you want me to talk about something, make sure to mention it. And I'll try to integrate that into class next time. And then we're off for 2 weeks, and then it's off into science fiction. So thank you very much, everybody, and I will look forward to hopefully seeing many of you tomorrow. Good night.